So let me just kick us off by offering a kind of concrete definition of culture and the criteria for using culture as a leadership tool. So culture is really about shared expectations about what should happen in a particular setting. And one thing that's true about culture is, some people say, well, this organization has no culture. Well, that's actually not true. All organizations have culture. Some are good, some are bad, some are helpful, some are not helpful. And so it turns out that you don't really have a choice about whether a culture forms in an organization. Anytime you have people coming together on a regular basis where they're interacting and things like their job responsibilities and their status in the organization are at stake, cultural norms will form, patterns of behaviors and expectations will form. So you don't have a choice over that. What you do have a choice over is, what is the nature of that culture? How strong is it? How aligned with your strategy is it? How adaptive is it over time? And in fact, those are the three criteria that we think about for an effective culture. An effective culture is one that prioritizes the most important strategic behaviors for your organization. A second criterion is that the culture is strong, and we mean by that people both agree about what's important and there's intensity around it. They're willing to sort of back it up with action. People are rewarded for upholding the culture, and there are consequences for a failure to uphold the culture. And the third criterion is that the culture is adaptive over time. But what we're seeing right now in the COVID environment is a really fast ability to shift the culture in significant ways. And I think that's a good thing. And I think organizations that are making those shifts, given the changing nature of the environment, are actually not only going to move in strategically relevant ways and come out stronger, they're also going to retain a capacity in the long run for recognizing their ability to change faster than they ever thought they could. Organizations can be weak in two different ways. One is they can be weak if there's a lot of talk about the culture, but no real backup to it, a kind of vacuous culture where there's a high level of agreement. Oh, we want to be, number one in customer service, but no real, right? The post office believes that. And, but there's no real depth to it. The other is that you could have conflicting views of the culture, what we call warring factions, which is a dramatic name for, a disagreement about what the culture is and what it should be. And both are forms of what I consider to be sort of weaker cultures. What we mean by a strong culture is that there's consistency and comprehensiveness. And that's when culture really has potency in an organization, when people see consistency and comprehensiveness. And the reason is because that's when they believe the culture is real. And that's when they're willing to take a risk on behalf of upholding the culture. That's their proof point, right? That there's consistency and comprehensiveness. So when Melinda talks about, even suppliers' new organizations, the organization for these things, that's the kind of consistency and comprehensiveness that leads people to believe it's real.
As Jenny said, oftentimes people talk about culture as if it's this fuzzy thing that is very subjective, and in fact, it is something that can be measured. And to be able to actually measure something that's about human behavior and human interaction is extremely helpful, because not only can you gain a baseline understanding of where you are, you can assess where you want to go, and you can see how your progress is going along the way. And that really helps just in so many ways, but not least of which is just communication, alignment, understanding, having a shared lexicon, and a sense of, actually being able to track progress and know what's changing. So I would say that's one piece is, within the definition, is realizing that it's actually quite a measurable and manageable aspect. It's also the glue. It's an aspect of the affiliation that we feel to the companies that we work in, a very, very powerful one, because it's really the source of our norms. And so it's something we look to and we measure ourselves against, and we're constantly regulating against. And when we're not physically together, that's a lot harder to do. So creating a norm around Zoom is a really different thing than existing in an office and interacting in meetings, et cetera, live. And so, losing that sense of affiliation or glue is really quite a risk, I think, to organizations right now if they're not tending to it very actively and trying to find ways to really overcompensate for the separation that we're all experiencing.
At Geo, one of the shifts that they engaged in was it was the commercial side of a business that was selling immunologic and ophthalmologic medicine. And part of the challenge in the culture was that people were losing their sort of sense of passion around helping patients and driving innovation and exploration in service of helping patients. And so one of the shifts they made, a very small but a very significant one, was that rather than starting meetings with business, they started meetings with a patient story of how the medicines that they were making available had helped a patient. And instead of talking about how many vials they had sold, they talked about how many patients they helped. So the kind of awareness around what it is you're trying to do strategically can be effectively woven into the culture.
But the point was, and this is where I think sort of stepping back about culture in general, is it can be viewed as an add-on. Like, we don't have the luxury of that right now. That's a nice to have. We've got work to do, and then we'll pay attention to our culture. What this points out is this one of the examples, the example Jenny just gave, is it's an example of how it's really just about how you do what you already do, and ensuring that you use every vehicle you have at your disposal. And a couple of you just listed some of these off, to continue to emphasize the aspects of the culture that are strategically important and enabling of your future success, but you're doing it through vehicles you already have.
At its best, an organizational culture ought to provide members of the organization with a roadmap to navigate, in particular, the conflicting priorities of your strategy. It ought to help people navigate through and figure out what's the most important thing to pay attention to, given the fact that there are a lot of important things to pay attention to. And so, again, I would emphasize that you don't have a choice about whether a culture will form. A culture will form. But what we see is that organizations who are more deliberate in, doing the small things, as Jennifer described, or in the organization that Gail described, that really show the deliberate priorities in strategic terms of the organization, will help people make those tough decisions, judgment calls, and trade-offs at their level of the organization. It actually provides a kind of strategic insight about what's really important.